The wind sang low across the open plains, rattling the loose boards of a half-forgotten ranch house. It had stood alone for years, much like the man who owned it. Elias Kane, a giant of a cowboy, shoulders broad as a barn door, his hands so large they seemed built more for breaking stone than handling reins. Folks in town whispered about him, calling him the bear of the frontier. He worked the land, broke wild horses, and hauled more weight than two men together, but his house stood empty, the rooms silent save for the groaning of winter storms. In truth, Elias had grown used to the quiet, until quiet began to feel like a punishment. It was hunger that finally pushed him toward change. Not hunger of the belly, Elias could live on jerky and beans for weeks. It was hunger of the heart, that gnawing emptiness after long days when the firelight flickered against bare walls. He ate alone, he worked alone, and when he woke to the sun breaking over endless acres, there was no voice to greet him. He'd once believed he didn't need anyone. But the weight of solitude was heavier than any cattle yoke. The town's notice board carried a scrap of paper tacked to it, widow seeking work. Can cook, clean, sew. Will take fair wage, no children to burden. Elias had stood staring at it far longer than he intended, his big fingers brushing the edge as though the paper might vanish if he blinked. A widow, he thought. Someone who knew loss. Someone who wouldn't chatter idly about dances or ribbons, but who might understand the ache of being left behind. Her name was Clara Hensley, and when Elias rode into town to meet her, he almost turned back twice. He wasn't used to speaking to women, especially not one with eyes like hers, a soft brown with flecks of gold that caught the lamplight. She stood on the boardwalk in a plain dress, her hands folded, as though bracing herself for disappointment. She expected another rejection, another door closed. You the widow lookin' for work? Elias asked, his voice deeper than thunder. Yes, sir, she answered, steady though her fingers clutched her shawl. I can cook near anything, and I don't scare easy at chores. If you've got a ranch, I can keep it. Elias studied her a long moment, unsure how to explain the hollow space in his chest. He only said, I need someone. Place is too empty. And so Clara rode back with him that evening, bundled on the wagon seat beside him. The sky stretched out in fiery reds as the sun bled into the horizon, and Elias noticed something he hadn't felt in years. The air didn't taste so bitter with another breathing beside him. She didn't chatter, didn't pry, only asked the names of his horses, listening as though their stories mattered. Her smile was small but real, the kind a person wore when they'd seen sorrow but still chose to give warmth. The first night at the ranch, she lit the stove and filled the kitchen with scents Elias had nearly forgotten. Bread baking, meat simmering slow, coffee stronger than river whiskey. He sat at the table, his massive hands folded awkwardly, watching her move with quiet grace. She was not young, not girlish, lines etched her face, but they deepened her beauty rather than dimmed it. Elias had seen plenty of pretty faces in saloons, fleeting, shallow. But this was different. Clara's presence filled the room like a lantern, chasing shadows from the corners of his soul. When she set his plate before him, he cleared his throat. You didn't have to make it fancy. It's not fancy, she said, smiling faintly. It's food, and food is meant to comfort, not just fill. He ate slow, savoring each bite more than he cared to admit. For once, the silence around the table wasn't heavy, it was companionable, stitched with small glances in the gentle rhythm of her humming as she moved about the kitchen. Elias realized then that the emptiness inside him wasn't hunger for food at all. It was hunger for exactly this, someone who could sit across from him, smile at him, and remind him he was still a man and not just a machine built to endure. That night, when Elias lay in his bed, he stared at the ceiling long after the fire died. The house no longer creaked like a lonely coffin, it breathed with the presence of another soul. And somewhere deep inside, where years of silence had hardened him, a tender shoot of hope pressed upward, fed by nothing more than the curve of a widow's smile. Morning came with the smell of biscuits and bacon drifting through the house. Elias stirred from bed, blinking at sunlight that felt warmer than it had in years. He dressed quickly, pulling on his boots with a strange urgency, not to work, but to see if the woman downstairs was real and not some dream conjured from loneliness. Clara was already at the stove, hair tied back, sleeves rolled, humming softly as she flipped the biscuits in the pan. Elias paused in the doorway, towering like a shadow, uncertain whether to step closer. She looked up, caught him staring, and instead of flinching as others did, she simply smiled. Coffee's on the table, she said, voice gentle. Best drink it before it goes cold. He did as told, lowering his giant frame onto the chair. The coffee was strong, sharper than anything he'd brewed himself. He swallowed, and for the first time in a long while, conversation came easier than the silence. He asked where she'd learned to cook so fine. Clara told him of her mother's kitchen, of years spent feeding her late husband during lean winters. There was sorrow in her words, but not bitterness, only a kind of quiet endurance that Elias found himself admiring more than anything. Days turned to weeks, and slowly the ranch began to change. Where dust and neglect once ruled, Clara's hands brought order and warmth. Curtains appeared on windows, fresh bread cooled on the sill. The house smelled of spices and soap instead of emptiness. Elias, for all his brute size, felt clumsy moving through this new rhythm. Yet every evening when he returned from the range, her smile at the door struck him harder than any fist ever had. He began to linger in the kitchen after meals, listening to Clara's stories. She spoke of simple things, a favorite recipe, the way her garden once bloomed, yet each word stitched something back together inside him. Elias realized how starved he'd been, not for food but for the sound of another voice meant only for him. Clara never mocked his silence or his awkwardness. She met his gruff replies with patience, her smile an anchor steadying the storm of years behind him. One night, a storm rolled over the plains, rattling shutters and tearing at the barn roof. Elias rushed out into the downpour to save the stock, expecting Clara to stay safe inside. But when he glanced back, she was there in the mud beside him, skirts soaked, helping secure the gates. Her hands shook with cold, yet she never complained. By the time they stumbled back to the house, dripping and shivering, Elias saw her not as a widow in need but as a partner, her strength hidden beneath gentleness. He caught himself watching her more often, the way her hair loosened from its knot as she worked, the light in her eyes when she laughed at his fumbling attempts to help in the kitchen. And yet, guilt shadowed his heart. He had no right, he thought, to want her smile for himself. She had belonged to another once, and he was nothing but a scarred giant who'd spent too many years alone. One evening, while mending tack by the fire, Elias finally asked the question that had weighed on him since the day he met her. "Clara," he said, voice rough, "why'd you choose to come out here? My place ain't much. You could have gone anywhere else." She looked up from her sewing, needle paused mid-stitch. For a long moment she studied him, her gaze steady. "Because you needed me," she said simply. "And maybe, I needed someone to need me again." Her words lodged deep, cutting through the armor he'd built around his heart. He had no answer, only sat in silence as she returned to her stitching, her smile soft and knowing. That night, Elias dreamed differently. Not of loneliness, not of battles fought against weather and cattle, but of a table with laughter around it, of warmth that never left when the fire burned low. For the first time in years, he believed that perhaps his hunger could be fed, not by food, not by labor, but by the quiet courage of a widow whose smile could mend even the deepest breaks in a starving man's soul. The peace they'd built was fragile, like a lantern glowing against endless dark. Elias knew it, even if he didn't speak it aloud. Out on the range, rumors stirred. Men at the saloon had begun to talk about the widow who'd moved into the Kane ranch, whispering that she was only there to dig into a giant's pockets, to find comfort at the cost of his pride. Elias ignored it at first, but the poison crept toward him all the same. One evening in town, he overheard a ranch hand laugh too loud. "That big ox of a cowboy finally bought himself a wife, can't find one on his own, so he hires a lonely widow to cook for him." The words sliced deep. Elias's fists tightened, and it took every shred of restraint not to break the man's jaw where he stood. But when he looked at Clara beside him, standing small yet proud, he realized her dignity mattered more than his rage. That night back at the ranch, silence fell heavy between them. Clara sensed the storm in his chest, and when he finally confessed the cruel talk he'd heard, she reached across the table, her hand warm against his massive knuckles. "Let them talk," she whispered. "They don't know you. They don't know me. What we build here is ours, no one else's." Still, Elias carried the weight of doubt. He rose before dawn, worked himself raw in the fields, as though sweat might drown the voices haunting him. But Clara's smile never faltered. Every evening she waited with supper warm and a kind word ready. When his shoulders sagged, she placed a gentle hand there, and the tension slipped away like dust in the wind. Her strength was quieter than his, yet stronger, the kind that bound wounds he couldn't see. Trouble came at last in the form of a cattle thief. A band had been stalking the valley, old enough to cut fences and drive off stock under cover of night. When Elias discovered the theft, rage burned hot and fierce. He saddled his horse, rifle in hand, ready to take back what was his. Clara stood in the doorway as he mounted, her eyes steady but filled with fear. "Promise me you'll come back," she said, voice low. "This ranch isn't worth losing you." Her plea followed him into the hills where he tracked the thieves. Under the moonlight, shots rang, rough voices shouted, and Elias fought like the bear they named him. When the dust cleared, he returned with his cattle and a gash across his arm, blood soaking his sleeve. Clara ran to him as he dismounted, her small frame pressing against his giant chest, sobbing not for the cattle but for the man who had come home alive. Elias, stunned by the depth of her worry, finally understood. It wasn't food she had given him, nor order to his house, it was something far greater. She had given him a reason to live beyond mere survival, beyond the endless grind of work and solitude. For the first time, the giant cowboy felt small, humbled before the strength of a widow's heart. That night, as the fire glowed low, Elias took Clara's hands in his. His voice trembled, a sound rare from a man who'd broken horses and faced storms without flinching. "You saved me," he said. "Not just today, every day since you walked through that door. My heart was starved, Clara. And you fed it with nothing but your smile." Tears filled her eyes, but her smile shone brighter than ever. She pressed his hands to her chest and whispered, "And you gave me back a home, Elias. Not walls and a roof, but a place where I belong." The house no longer stood as a hollow shell on the plains. It pulsed with life, with laughter, with the quiet bond forged in storms and silence. The giant cowboy had found more than a cook, he had found the one woman whose smile could banish his hunger, whose love made him stronger than any battle he had ever fought. And in the years to come, when neighbors whispered about them, it was no longer with cruelty but with awe, for they had seen with their own eyes how a lonely widow's smile had fed a starving heart, and how a giant cowboy had finally learned what it meant to be truly full.